of that panel, Liz Furr, Director General, European Telecommunications Network Operators Association, who is the host of the panel. So welcome warmly, Liz, as a moderator of the panel. I will call now the panelists. I'd like to invite Mr. Karol Okoński, Secretary of State, Polish Ministry of Digital Affairs, Government Plenipotentiary for Cybersecurity. Mr. Jakub Boratyński, Head of Unit, Cybersecurity and Digital Privacy, DG Connect, European Commission. Good morning. Robert L. Strayer, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Telecommunications and Information Policy, U.S. Department of State. General Włodzimierz Nowak, Member of the Management Board, Chief Security, Legal and Compliance Officer, T-Mobile Polska. And Ulf Persson, Vice President, Head of Government and Industrial Relations, Ericsson. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting ETNO here. ETNO is the leading trade association in Brussels. Our members represent 70% of the investment capital in infrastructure. That's also why it's, for me, very important to be here at a day where we are discussing 5G. And 5G is, of course, at the heart of our business, together with cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is equally important for all of us. I would actually like to set the scene a bit before we go over to the questions, because I think it's important when we discuss 5G and cybersecurity that we also look at what is surrounding it. So what we all believe is that 5G will be crucial for the future of all the citizens, of all the industries. And 5G is going to change a lot for all of Europe, but also worldwide. As we speak, and also as we've seen in the other presentations, we're getting more and more interlinked and interconnected. And cybersecurity is not only going to be a European problem. So that's why it's interesting to have this dialogue with different nationalities and different industries. But also, if we look at the figures of IoT, 2020, we're talking about 20 billion IoTs that will actually be connected to the internet. We'll also look at, in 2025, more than a trillion. If you combine this with AI, we're actually going to have a very interesting technology, but we're also going to have an increase in the need of cybersecurity. So for all the opportunities that 5G brings, this will also bring a lot of things that we need to discuss and be mindful of. And from that side, I think it's also important to think of this, and that's also been mentioned by, for example, the president of Estonia. This is not a problem only for the state, it's not a problem only for the business, it's a problem for businesses, it's a problem for states, and it's a problem for the citizens. And we all need to be together in this. So we need to look at the value chain here, and all need to take a responsibility in how we deal with the issues that are arising with new technologies. So again, I'm very happy to see we have both industry here, we have the device manufacturers, we also have US and telco, and also the state of Poland represented here, plus the Commission. So I would like us to look at this as a common problem we need to solve with a common solution. We need to discuss how we actually work together in solving all of this. And I would actually like to start with you, Minister Okoński. I've talked about a common approach, but how do you see the option for Europe in its own third way of securing 5G?
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I think you would agree with me that 5G is probably one of the topics that's mostly exploited recently, and at the same time also to some extent underestimated. And it sounds like a contradiction, but I think that you still hear, let's say, both extremes like very often. So on one hand, actually, it's still nonetheless, 5G is the next generation of wireless networks that builds actually on the current 4G LTE standards. Of course, increased bandwidth, the capacity, and the speed, definitely the factors that are worth mentioning. But at the same time, also the standards that are we would say, the backbone that will set that the future of the 5G also still under development. So to some extent, we're all commenting something that are still, the work in progress. So this will be, on one side. On the other side, on the other screen, I would say that the fact that the step forward from 4G to 5G is still like a tremendous one. It's like the capacity to be able to handle like billions of devices, like this ultra latency that it requires like near real-time communication, and the speed like at least 10 times faster than what's seeing right now, definitely creates a possibility and an occasion that like that at some point of time, like in years to come, like our life, our activities, what we do will heavily depend on the telecom infrastructure, and actually it does change the landscape then, because like it's still, if you consider that your how your energy is distributed, how your health is controlled. How you drive, or actually how you are driven, and how your military units operate, actually all depend on the safety of the infrastructure. It of course creates like a different, has to create different approach from the state perspective, and that's why vigorously, all states, including Poland, are speaking about having more control over this network, and I think it's in here. I think most countries also within the EU have more or less the same attitude. I mean, definitely they also want to keep more control over what's being built, of the design, the devices that are used, the vendors that have been selected. But at the same time, the path that the countries have to take has to be different, because the starting points are different. And also within the EU, most of the countries share the same vision. Still, the current landscape of infrastructure, the legal baseline, still differs very much between the countries. So, and Poland here is engaging like significantly in the work that the EU and all the member states are doing, and we want everyone to share the same vision. But nonetheless, I think the exact activities, the exact actions that the states will take will differ, because basically we start from a different perspective. Now, in terms of Poland. Until now, the telecom operators had like actually a full autonomy of making their decisions around the telecom infrastructure, and also how they build, what type of devices they use, and it might be very likely it also contributed to the fact that the prices people pay from telecom services in Poland are one of the lowest in Europe. But nevertheless, assuming that the significance and the criticality of the infrastructure rises dramatically, we still want to have be able at least evaluate and accept the decisions that the telecom operators make as far as the infrastructure is concerned, and it's mostly regards both the infrastructure as a speaking of hardware and software, but at the same time also the processes and the organization that is implemented in telecom operators entities, meaning that we would like to have a thorough, impose the thorough risk analysis process and risk mitigation plans that can be reviewed and can be checked whether they really assume all the factors that are vital not only for the economic benefit of the company, but also for the national security, knowing and assuming the fact that telecom infrastructure is and will be even more important for the whole nation. Another thing that we want to also bring to attention is the fact that we cannot be in a position that the whole network is dependent just on one vendor. Or let's say the connectivity in given region is dependent, let's say, on one vendor. And be it, let's say, the malicious activity of some just doing it unintentionally, but also the vulnerability that can expose like the whole network of being, not being to provide the services with the right quality that we expect. So we would like to advocate and set some rules for more diversification of vendors. So basically, the networks will not be dependent on one vendor only. And then from the European perspective, then I think, and coming back to the question whether the European is the third way or not, I think the third way is in the context that we at the same time want to have to balance our ambition to treat Europe as the digital single market being as homogeneous and as unified as possible. So it means that we should come up and bring to aspire to have the same standards, the same attitude toward how we treat the infrastructure. But still at the same time, it has to be combined with a national point of view, because every country will have their own, let's say, national touch to this. Like, for example, one of the topics that we are also evaluating here in Poland, and might be also the reality in sometime in the future, is the model of implementing 5G, basing, for example, on the public-private partnership. So trying to find a way, the best effective model that combines the economical benefits, but at the same time the safety and the security of the network.
Okay, thank you. And over to the Commission, Jakub Bransky. We hear the Minister Okonski talking about the solution and ideas here in Poland. So what do you think the role of harmonization as an approach in the 5G development? How will that work? And what are the consequences and outcomes of such an approach in order to see exposures to risk related to the 5G?
Thank you very much, Lisa, for this question. And first and foremost, I would like to really thank very warmly to the organizer. It's a great pleasure to be again in Cybersec and see it kind of growing and expanding exponentially. Now, 5G, in a way, is a fascinating test case of cooperation between member states in the area of cybersecurity. And this is for two reasons. First of all, of course, the stakes are extremely high. And you, Lisa, talked about it yourself. This is going to be critical for in the supply chain of many critical IT applications and new services of the future, which indeed, as Minister Okoński said, has also implications for national security. Secondly, it is really a challenge because the deployment is already taking place at a different pace, obviously, in member states. So the train has already departed. At the same time, as we know, the final shape of 5G technology is not yet known. This is in a way, the moving target. Now, since the moment when the Commission published its recommendation in March of this year, we have witnessed from member states an impressive level of commitment and willingness to move forward in short time with. And then again, word harmonization has certain legal, let's say, connotations. So I would prefer to say common approach to this delicate issue. And what is, I mean, I don't want to say it's a European feature, but indeed that was very much a common willingness, is that the European approach is very much a risk-based approach. So we do not try to come up kind of, shoot from the hip, but we really want to have a risk-based approach which would result in proportionate, sensible mitigating measures. This approach covers the whole spectrum of risk, including both the technical factors, again, where the challenge, of course, is related to the fact that this is a new developing technology, but we know what is at stake is the high degree of virtualization of 5G networks and unprecedented reliance of software. Again, I will not go into further details. And very importantly, let's say on an equal footing, the non-technical factors, recommendations was quite specific about it, and one example of non-technical factor to be taken into account are the legal and other requirements that can be required from suppliers to which they have to abide from third countries. Now, all member states, irrespective of their, let's say, stage of advancement in the process, they have contributed to the coordinated risk assessment, sending their national assessments according basically to a sort of a common format of reporting that we jointly agreed. And again, I would say it's unprecedented. It is, after all, just Commission recommendation, and we thought literally from all member states, from all 28 member states, a willingness to contribute. This risk assessment report that was published 3 weeks ago, on 9th of October, presents in a systematic manner the main threat actors, assets, vulnerabilities, and finally, for illustrative purposes, the most, let's say, significant risk scenarios. Again, I will not be now detailing what's in the report, but indeed the approach was very systematic, and I think what is quite also unusual, it was not EU report, it was EU report which is literally a sum of national contributions, national risk assessments, and again, member states were able to agree on what is in this report on the basis of the consensus. In summary, the risk assessment found that basically the technological challenge introduced by 5G creates a situation that the overall attack surface number of potential entry points of attackers is greatly expanding in comparison with the previous generations of mobile communication. Of course, while we are focusing on vulnerabilities and risk, we are also obviously cognizant of the fact that 5G is also bringing opportunities for major security improvements, notably, for example, in the area of authentication in the context of radio access. So this increased attack surface can be exploited by various threat actors, and we have seen, you see this graph in the report, which very nicely, which is again a sort of a result of a combined intelligence from member states, which clearly shows that what is considered to be the highest risk are the non-state or state-backed actors, which because of their capabilities, intended resources, they actually can successfully attack EU member states' telecommunication network. And in this context, and it is important to note, and in that I also echo what Minister Okoński has said, that a major dependency on single supplier, it is one of those specific factors that increase the exposure and consequences of a potential failure. As you know, the Commission now, together with Member States and ENISA, is working on the toolbox of mitigating measures, which is due by the end of December. At this stage, it's premature to say what it would be, but again, already the recommendation itself has identified, several existing possibilities, such as security requirements, which are applicable to the previous generation of mobile networks, procurement rules, or general conditions, or conditions for licensing in the procedures for the spectrum allocation. This discussion is now ongoing with member states, so we have basically quite an intensive, let's say, pace of the meetings. Coming forward, I would say I'm quite optimistic about the fact that we will be able to produce a meaningful toolbox of measures. But I mean, ultimately, and in that sense, I can also refer to what Minister Okoński has said. You know, ultimately, it will be member states, you know, taking decisions, taking responsibility for how those measures would be applied in an effective manner, taking into account the national specifics, you know, the legacy, of course, of what is now the situation in the market. But nevertheless, I think, again, as I said in the beginning, it's a test for EU cooperation in cybersecurity, and probably when we will meet again, I don't know, maybe perhaps in Katowice a year from now, that will be probably a perfect moment actually to take the stock and see how much we truly manage actually to achieve together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us over to the Transatlantic Cooperation, Ambassador Strayer. We've heard now from Poland, you've heard from the Commission. So what do you think the cooperation, the Transatlantic Cooperation can actually bring in the 5G development?
Thanks, Lisa, for that question. Thanks for organizing the panel. And it's a privilege to be here in Katowice, and I want to thank Isabella and her team and for this wonderful Cybersec conference. You know, in the United States, we've got commitments from our 4 largest carriers to only use trusted vendors for their 5G build-outs. And as Secretary Okoński noted, there are differences in where we start from, but we think that it's important that we apply similar principles as we move forward. We now have an executive order in the United States that will prohibit untrusted vendors as a matter of law from going into our domestic networks. That will result in concrete regulations very soon. Our Federal Communications Commission is separately about to vote on a order that will not allow any of our, what we call our Universal Service Fund, which is a public funding mechanism to go to untrusted vendors, Huawei and ZTE. It will also set up a process to consider how we can help fund our smaller rural carriers to replace untrusted vendors in their networks. That will be an ongoing process, how to replace that untrusted technology. We were very encouraged to see this product that the European Union came up with, that Jacob and others there and the member states had worked on. I mean, it highlights a number of the understandings that we have that inform our views about 5G security, including recognizing that we're seeing a vastly expanded cyber attack surface area because the increased virtualization of functions and the role of software in all parts of the 5G network. It's going to have extending software from not just the core, but to the edge. There's going to be distributed computing throughout the network, meaning that all parts of the network are potentially vulnerable, and all parts are locations where a nation state could exfiltrate citizens' data. So for those that care about citizens' data, which we do in the United States, and I know folks do in Europe, it's important to recognize that any part of that 5G network where there's computing power is a place where someone can exfiltrate data and use it for purposes that have not been authorized. We also thought it was very important that report also noted that the what they call lawful intercept capabilities that occur at the base stations at the edge of the network are going to become more software driven and are places for compromise as well. So we think that the analysis that was then laid out of saying you have to look at suppliers, because suppliers that are potentially backed by nation states could introduce backdoors into operating systems and the firmware that runs the technology. They need to have a close, careful analysis, and we think that the analysis that looks at the ability of the third country's laws to assert control over that vendor without, as the report says, democratic checks and balances, that is without an independent judiciary or rule of law standing between the government, in the case it would be China, and their vendors, Huawei and ZTE, means that they're potentially under the control of the government. The report also highlights the need to look at the ownership structure of the company, as well as the ability for a government to exert coercion over the company. In our view, you look at something like the Chinese National Intelligence Law from 2017 that requires all entities in China to comply with the mandates of the security and intelligence services and to keep their cooperation secret. That's all you really need to know about the ability of a government to have that kind of control over a company. Again, in their situation, there's no way for the company to object. There's no rule of law system there. There's no independent judiciary. And in fact, the government has put members of the Communist Party into controlling roles within the company. So we think it's very important that because of the ability to update tens of millions of lines of code almost instantaneously, where there's no real way to review that software code for vulnerabilities, that you need to inherently have a trust relationship with the vendor of that technology. And there's really 4 quick myths that I think we need to dispel about why, that some have offered up about why they can't move to trusted vendors. The first is it'll be some massive delay of 18 months or more. Well, in the United States, we're only using trusted vendors. We're using Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung for the radio access network portion of the network, and that's where there's this limitation number of vendors. We have no delay. In fact, the GSMA's own analysis says that in just a few years, North America will have twice as many 5G connections as a percentage of overall connections than there will be in Asia. The second point is that it's going to be inordinately expensive to replace untrusted vendors. Well, moving to 5G, the legacy technology from before 2016 has to be replaced anyway. So you're only talking about the most recently added components. You can let those be replaced over their normal life cycles of atrophy. And a recent report said that that entire cost would probably only be about $3.5 billion for all of Europe, or about €7 per customer in Europe. The third argument that we hear a lot of is that you can just protect the core and not protect the edge. But as I mentioned before, if there's consumer data at the edge, the real question is which consumers are you going to allow to have their data taken by an untrustworthy vendor and potentially sent to an authoritarian state. There's a number of concerns that we have, particularly about the willingness of China to use data. They've obviously used their ability to access data in the past through one of the largest acts of industrial espionage in recent history. The United States and more than 12 countries attributed the Cloud Hopper attacks to the Chinese Ministry of State Security. They compromised cloud providers and then shared that information with their private sector. They've also used data that they've acquired through surveillance technologies and basically formed an authoritarian surveillance state in the Xinjiang province to put more than 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps. So they have a disregard that we have in the West of democratic values and due process related to data. Huawei itself has now extended that surveillance technology to more than 12 countries around the world so that they also can use it in an authoritarian manner. So, the real myth that's not been totally dispelled is that in some cases, Huawei is offering bargain basement prices for their technology. And there's a saying in the technology field that if you don't know who the product is, it's probably you and your data. Well, with the willingness of the Chinese state to so substantially back with financing and subsidization Huawei, I think it's a fair question to ask. Who is the product when they're offering that kind of networking gear so cheaply? Is it the citizens of Europe, and is it their data? Thanks.
Thank you. Now we've heard from Poland, we've heard from the Commission, we also heard from the US, and Ambassador Estrella saying all part of networks are vulnerable. So, General Novak, given the importance the mobile networks have, and that the mobile operators are the one taking care of this infrastructure and ensuring them also in relation to, of course, national security, what are the roles of operators, and how should a cooperation between private, public be in this role?
First of all, we must remember that the pure mobile network not exist. Most of the operators are currently the convergent operators. It means that including the TV is in the network. This gives us an absolutely different picture of the security. In that reason, the convergent network must be protected on the different way. I usually in my position, trying to emphasize especially the technological and productions aspect, because we as a telco operators, going to use the devices which are under the special requirements. It means that they have a standards, they have a special regulation which can build the trust to the vendors and trust to the devices. But the 5G is the special things which will happen very soon. We will develop the network from 5G LTE to the 5G. Of course, it will be the smooth development, but in the meantime, we are implementing a lot of IoT devices in the network. What it means? It means that most of the IoT devices don't have any security mechanism. It means that they are potentially the part of the botnet. And we trying to organize this IoT part in a special narrow-band IoT network in order to protect them. But could be much better if the regulation gives to the producer of such a devices the requirements that they should produce the IoT devices, including some security mechanism. It could be much easier for us to provide the security. Another issue is management and utilization of the network. True speaking, our network and devices are secure up to the first update. It means that we are testing the devices, we are testing the network, testing the software, but after the first update, we don't know it is still secure or not. Of course, the trust to the vendor is really important, but it seems to me that the density of the devices in the global network will be so high that we should try to change our mind how to organize the adaptation of the network to the new purposes. What it means? Maybe we should not download the updates directly from the server of the vendors. Of course, we are trust to the vendors, but some of the guys said the higher level of the trust is the control. What it means? Maybe nationally we should organize the jump server where the updates will be collected and somebody on the governmental level, for example, could assess the update and say, okay, you can download it to the network. Because our life will be mostly in the network. Nearly everything will be connected with the data. In that reason, we should really carefully look for any updates which we are downloading. Of course, also users are very important in this part, because, for example, looking for my previous job as a military, I can imagine that the 5G devices closely connected with the geolocalization, and if one soldier have the mobile on 5G in his pocket, he can disclose the command post where it is. It is also something which should be taken into consideration. We, as a telco, we are trying to provide the full services to the users, but nevertheless, some users should assess they can use it in some circumstances or not, or they should resign of such services. Generally speaking, as I said, we expect some regulation which can give to the producers of the devices, IoT and other devices which we will use in the network, some regulation of the standards, purely standards. If the standards will be on the proper level of security, the network will be much secure than is now, for example. My concern is also the one concern, true speaking. These regulations should be implemented as soon as possible, because every day the more and more IoT is connected, more devices are implemented to the network without some standards. If we don't have a standards, it can escalate the problems in the future.
Thank you. And last but not least, Ulf Persson, now we've actually heard that networks are getting more softwareized, and also we've heard that networks have vulnerabilities all over. So as 5G is actually extremely complex structure, how do you see the risk assessment, and how do we actually ensure that the essential elements of security are there?
Thank you, Lisa, for that question, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me to this very important forum. I'm very happy to be here. And just to say that I will speak as representing a global company. We're in 180 markets. We're rolling out 5G on 4 continents right now. And I should say that the 5G security debate is definitely not only European or transatlantic. It is a global issue, and my response will be reflecting our global footprint. First, I think, and it's been highlighted here already, I think, and also in the EU risk assessment, that when you look at the end users' de facto experience of security, you need to look at the deployed networks. You need to have a holistic approach here. Oftentimes, especially earlier, the debate has been very narrowly focusing on products, on source code, or on vendors. I think that policymakers need to take a much more holistic and joined-up approach, and looking at all the interdependencies that you find in a deployed network. So that includes the standards, it includes the products, both hardware and software. It includes how you deploy the network and how you configure a network, and not least how you also operate the network on a daily basis. So all of these 4 aspects need to be looked at. And but starting from the vendor perspective, as Ericsson, looking at 2 areas where we definitely have a role to play. First, of course, is standards. And here, I believe that if you look at the EU process, I think it's very important that you make use of those standards that are available here. That's 3GPP SECAM, that's GSMA NESAS. Those should be very important tools for EU to consider. And here definitely, and I heard that approach also from not least the minister, we need a harmonized approach here in Europe, and not do anything as a national approach on this level. Secondly, from the Ericsson product point of view, of course, for us it would include things like security by design, security functions, and security assurance schemes. And we have very elaborate processes for that. But as has been recognized, it also is extremely important that you include the actual configuration of the network, and that, of course, rests primarily with the operators' responsibility there. They are in control. Of course, we need to make the appropriate take the appropriate measures from the vendor perspective, but the critical decisions are made by the operator. To sum up here, I think the important thing is that security cannot be a thing just resting on the vendors like Ericsson or the operators. It's actually both. Both need to be included here to secure the network. But as already been referred to by Jakob here, it's not only in the risk assessments, not only about the technical factors, it's also about the so-called non-technical or trust factors. And here, of course, in the EU risk assessment, there has been a listing of objective criteria for identification of such risks. And obviously, this is the sensitive part of the 5G security debate. Looking once again, as Ericsson, from the global perspective and global observations, we see, of course, that those countries that have already acted and taken mitigation decisions based on non-technical factors have done so with aim to protect the national security. And it's definitely not about choosing or benefiting certain vendors. In most cases, these countries have no local or national vendors, so it's not sort of prioritizing or benefiting we can see also, of course, that globally on this issue, looking at the technical and non-technical factors, there have been different paths chosen. Those that have started from the non-technical side, they are now starting to look at the technical requirements. Of course, many countries, including then, of course, the whole of the EU, are starting with the technical factors, but are now starting to grapple with the non-technical factors. But to sum up, I think it's clear that security, that is technology, trust, the non-technology factors are viewed by policymakers as different and independent considerations and assessment, but both need to be satisfied. And in other words, a trusted vendor with a poor security or vice versa is not good enough. And of course, we see in the trust debate, it's increasingly recognized to be about autonomy and independence of the state. And gradually we see that this is not only about vendors, but also about operators. That hasn't been picked up yet in the EU recommendation. Maybe it will come in the toolbox. We will see in the next step. So, of course, still there's a lack of consensus in Europe how to address this. And of course, in many cases, it's a balancing act between security and trust issues, and on the other hand, economic issues in a very wide sense. But I think just to finalize and say that the issue should never be about that there are no European vendors that have the commercial and technical capabilities to roll out 5G. Ericsson is in a strong position, and of course, Nokia is doing very well there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just ask two quick questions, and unfortunately I cannot make it to everyone, but I have one for you, Minister Okonski, and that is, how do we reconcile security and the massive needs for investment that is actually prognosed for 5G? We're talking about a 500 billion investment over a few years.
Okay, just before I go to your questions, a very quick comment, yes, because I had the position of listening to all my prominent speakers after me. So just one of the comments. I definitely, this discussion, who should play the key role, whether the vendor or the operator or the policymaker. I think it will remain unsolved, or can be just solved in the way it's still distributed among them, basically. And I think in terms what is a key, I think here is still a business application. I mean, you might think of having some minimal security requirements that should be shared by all devices, all appliances or software, but nevertheless the final decision of whether in this one specific case some extra security is needed will always come from the business application, basically where you use it for what purpose. So and then whatever regulations we as a policymaker will impose on telecom operators, we are aware, and it is our intention. Of course, they will be actually passed over to the vendors, and this is, I think, the right way to do it. And in terms of the updates, I think it's also something very difficult to solve. Here, probably, having a trustworthy partner definitely is like one of the decisive factors. Another thing is having as much transparency as possible on the side of development processes, supply chain management on the side of vendors. So you can actually, even if you don't control him, he'll be aware of the fact that you are in the position to check and see and spot what was actually the steps taken in order to produce or procure a given product. So the risk analysis and transparency being the key aspects here. Now coming back to your question very quickly, I think it's still the investment definitely is a very is a key factor here in the development of the networks. But nevertheless, and this is what Ambassador Stroy said, in the end there's a constant actually wave of replacing the equipment like on and on. And actually the capital expenditure of telecom operators on investment is surprisingly maybe, but it's not the biggest share. I mean, of their revenue. It's still actually usually it's marketing, not the investment infrastructure, because of such a high competition. the prices have to be kept as low as possible. So I think here, and in this respect, I mean, this question is vital in the sense that, of course, we have to keep the market as competitive and as open as possible to the extent that we will be not monopolized by any vendor. So here, of course, we are reflecting a situation that the market is dominated by just a few players, but nevertheless, I still assume and hope, and this is what Robert again said that happened in the States, that even if the number of vendors is limited, as long as there are two of them, there is still competition that can drive the prices low. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left, and I actually would really like us to wrap up with a few recommendations, because what we'd like to come out of this panel is also some recommendations both for the business sector and also the public sector. And actually I would start in the other end with you, Ulf Persson, from the business side.
Yes, coming back to the theme of my intervention, I think it's extremely important that there is a holistic approach taken here, and that includes, of course, the technical factors, but also the non-technical factors. And adding also the issue, which has not been that much highlighted yet in the debate, but of course, not only focus on vendors, but I think you also need to include the operators, of course, because as I think it was said by Minister Konski, because this is sort of a joint responsibility. It's vendors, it's operators, it's government and authorities.
Thank you. General Novak from T-Mobile side.
As I mentioned, very important, the standards and the time of the implementation of the standards. We are following the direction which are established by the European Union and government in Poland. And we are waiting for some regulation which can help us to quickly implement the 5G.
Ambassador Strayer.
Thank you. I think we need to retain humility about what security testing and evaluation can do. It's very important we adopt cybersecurity best practices from a technical perspective, but we also need those non-technical factors to evaluate who will be providing those software updates, who's really guiding the development of the software. It's hopefully not a nation state. The other thing I'd say is we need to keep this market dynamic. We need to see more innovation in the future. Steps have been taken to try to open up the interface between the radio units and the baseband units. We need to see more dynamism in the market, and as we see more virtualization of software too, of virtualization of functions and more software, we're going to see more potential leaps ahead in innovation as we go to potentially even end-to-end software-driven networks. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that we're not sitting in a static technology area. All tech is dynamic, but I think especially in telecom, it needs to keep advancing and seeing the promise of innovation bring greater potential to us all.
Thank you. And from the Commission side?
Yes. I see all of this as a major opportunity. I mean, just some time ago, definitely the security of telecom networks wouldn't make it into a starting panel of this conference. And so, in fact, we are somehow, given the magnitude of the security challenges, we are having a sort of a paradigm shift which really requests from us to reassess the current policy framework and the way of basically doing business. That, among others, is also a question of what is happening now. We are now, I think, breaking a silo between the telecom sector and cybersecurity sector, which was not the case before. And indeed, I see that we would be looking in a comprehensive way to identify basically gaps in the existing frameworks, talking not just about regulation, but also enforcement mechanisms, the role of supervisory authorities, the respective obligations of mobile operators, of vendors. And then when I say about paradigm shift, actually 5G is also a major opportunity for us to actually look into the overall issue of increasing security of digital supply chain, because this has been somehow neglected, and I think through that, we are really, having this opportunity. I also see it very practically. I was happy to also see that the Polish Prime Minister referred to the Cybersecurity Act, which creates a certification framework. Again, sensible ways of certifying software, which in a sense is a major challenge and which is, of course, crucial from the point of view of 5G, again, would be one of those, let's say, possible opportunities that we will consume thanks to this basically major investment and political will that is around this subject.
Thank you, and over to you, Minister.
Just, okay, I'm speaking, I think, too much time here. So just a very last comment. It's like, I would like to also, add to what I said before. Yes, the interoperability, open standards, especially in this radio access network part, definitely a thing to be considered because it will actually allow us to avoid any vendor lock-in. And then yes, in the standards that are now under development right now, to make sure that we include all of what we would call the security by design. So it's not only the efficiency, but of course all the features that will help to control how the device is finally used.
Thank you very much. And I must say, you actually confirmed that we all need to work together in achieving the best level of security. And it is a dynamic and complex world we're moving into. And it's both on the political side, but also on the technology side, and especially with technology developing so fast. So what is more appropriate than actually discussing this on the 50th anniversary of the internet, which it is today. So I'm very happy you joined us here. And everyone, please join me in giving a great applause to our panelists.